kept out of sight, lost in confusion. Still, I don't know why you covered your eyes. Is it just an illusion? Well, I know it's just a matter of time, just a matter of time before you give it a try. Just a matter of finding the way to your heart and the way to
Les damos la bienvenida a este auditorio, en donde vamos a dar paso a la conferencia magistral de la profesora Marta Nussbaum, recientemente galardonada en la noche de ayer con el doctorado honoris causa por parte de esta universidad. Nos congratula mucho poderla tener aquí en el marco de los 70 años de la universidad, de los 70 años del Departamento de Filosofía. Para comenzar, quiero pedirle al doctor Luis Guerrero Martínez, director del Departamento de Filosofía, que nos haga el favor de hacer una pequeña presentación de la profesora Nussbaum.
Buenos días a todos. Como lo dijo mi colega Francisco, para la Universidad Iberoamericana es un privilegio contar con la presencia de la doctora Marta Nussbaum con ocasión de las celebraciones del 70 aniversario de la Universidad Iberoamericana. El día de ayer recibió el doctorado honoris causa en este mismo recinto. Aunque para la mayoría de nosotros es conocida la admirable trayectoria de la profesora Nussbaum, me permito hacer un breve esbozo académico de ella. Nacida en la ciudad de Nueva York, su trayectoria académica es prolífica. Estudió teatro y lenguas clásicas en la Universidad de Nueva York. Posteriormente se doctoró en Filosofía por la Universidad de Harvard en 1975. Ha impartido clases en las universidades de Oxford, Harvard, Brown y actualmente en la Universidad de Chicago. Ha publicado más de 20 libros, la mayoría traducidos a diversos idiomas, entre los que destacan La fragilidad del bien, fortuna y ética en la tragedia y la filosofía griega, de 1986, La terapia del deseo, teoría y práctica en la ética y la mística, de 1994, El cultivo de la humanidad, 1997, Las mujeres y el desarrollo humano, el enfoque de las capacidades, del 2000, El ocultamiento de lo humano, repugnancia, vergüenza y ley, del 2004, Las fronteras de la justicia, consideraciones sobre la exclusión, del 2005, Libertad de conciencia, en defensa de la tradición de la igualdad religiosa de los Estados Unidos, del 2008, Sin fines de lucro, ¿por qué la democracia necesita las humanidades?, del 2010, y su más reciente libro es Emociones políticas, ¿por qué el amor importa para la justicia?, del 2013. Fue invitada por Amartya Sen, Premio Nobel de Economía en 1998, para trabajar en el Instituto Mundial de Investigaciones de Economía del Desarrollo de la Universidad de las Naciones Unidas y colaborar en temas relacionados con el desarrollo económico y la ética. Uno de los frutos de esta colaboración es la coautoría con el mismo Amartya Sen en el libro La calidad de vida, de 1993. Fue fundadora y coordinadora del Centro de Constitucionalismo Comparado, fue presidenta de la Asociación Americana Grado, de la que es miembro actualmente, ha presidido el Comité para la Cooperación Internacional y el Comité para la Situación de la Mujer de la Asociación Americana de Filosofía. Por otra parte, ha sido miembro del Consejo de la Academia Americana de las Artes y Ciencias y de la Unión del Consejo Americano de Sociedades de Estudio. El prestigio que se ha ganado por la seriedad de sus trabajos académicos y por su preocupación por diversas causas puntuales de la sociedad y cultura contemporánea le han merecido diversas condecoraciones en todo el mundo. Ha recibido recibido el doctorado honoris causa por más de 50 universidades en Asia, América y Europa, entre las que cabe mencionar la Escuela Normal Superior en Francia, en Georgetown University en Estados Unidos, la Universidad de Haifa en Israel, la Universidad de Toronto en Canadá, la Universidad de Edimburgo en Escocia, la Universidad Católica de Lovaina en Bélgica y, como había mencionado, el doctorado por nuestra Universidad Iberoamericana. El año pasado recibió el Premio Príncipe de Asturias de Ciencias Sociales. Muchas gracias por su presencia para celebrar con nosotros este encuentro académico.
Bueno, muchas gracias al doctor Guerrero. Sin más preámbulo, vamos a escuchar a la profesora Nussbaum. Nos va a presentar una conferencia que lleva por título Principios políticos y la vida buena en una sociedad pluralista. El formato que vamos a seguir es que escucharemos la conferencia y al finalizar tendremos un espacio para las preguntas y las respuestas que estén interesados en formularle a la profesora.
Hello. Thank you very much, Professor Castro and Professor Guerrero. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have a chance to discuss ideas with all of you. So I want to say, before I begin the lecture, that during the Q&A, the first 3 questions should come from students. So be preparing your questions. All over the world, people are struggling for a life that is fully human, a life worthy of their human dignity. Countries and states are often focused on economic growth alone, but their people, meanwhile, are striving for something different. They want meaningful human lives. They need theoretical approaches that can be the ally of those struggles, not approaches that keep those struggles from view. As the late Mahmoud ul-Haq wrote in 1990, the real wealth of a nation is its people, and the purpose of development is to create an enabling environment for people to enjoy long, healthy, and creative lives. This simple but powerful truth is all too often forgotten in the pursuit of material and financial wealth, end quote. Ul-Haq's statement, which was advanced on behalf of an insurgent group of philosophers and economists with which I've long been connected, concerns a political art of living, if you will. It asks how political principles, both national and ultimately global, might be involved in promoting good lives for people. In defiance of standard economic norms, it insists that the purpose of development is not primarily to create wealth, but instead to promote meaningful lives. But his statement also contains an interesting restriction. It does not say that the purpose of development is to create flourishing lives. It says instead that its purpose is to create an enabling environment for people to enjoy such lives. So both the positive and the negative side of Ul-Haq's statement will be the subject of my talk. First, I'll ask why we should think of the goal of a nation as it tries to develop in terms of meaningful lives, or what is known as human development, instead of the more common ways of measuring development with reference to wealth or even utility. Then, in the second part of the lecture, I'll turn to his restriction. Why should political principles be framed in terms of enabling, or what the theory to which he alludes calls capability, rather than actual functioning? The answer to this question will lead us to focus on the type of pluralism about goals and ends that ought to be respected and accommodated in any just society. So first, development, human capabilities, not wealth or utility. To understand the positive side of human development, we need a case we can examine. So consider then Vasanti, a woman in her 30s in the Indian state of Gujarat. I've discussed her in two of my books, actually. Vasanti's husband was a gambler and an alcoholic. He used the household money to get drunk, and when he ran out of that money, he got a vasectomy in order to take the cash incentive payment offered by local government. So Vasanti had no children to help her. Eventually, as her husband became more and more physically abusive, she could no longer live with him, and she returned to her own family. Her father, who used to make Singer sewing machine parts, was dead, but her brothers were running an auto parts business in what used to be the father's shop. Using one of the father's old machines and living in the shop itself, Vasanti earned a small income making eye holes for the hooks on sari tops. Meanwhile, her brothers gave her a loan to get another machine, the one that rolls the silk on the edges of the sari. She took the money, but she didn't like being dependent on men. They were married and had children, so that support could have stopped at any time. With the help of the Self-Employed Women's Association, which is known as Seva, a fine non-governmental organization founded by the world-renowned women's advocate Ela Bhatt, she got a bank loan of her own and paid back the brothers. By the time I met her, she had paid back almost all of the Seva loan itself. She was also enrolled in Seva's educational programs and was learning to read and write and was acquiring other skills that promoted greater independence and participation. What theoretical approach could direct attention to the important features of Vasanti's situation, promote an adequate analysis of it, and make pertinent recommendations for action? Such an approach would need to focus on education, political participation, on health and bodily integrity, and, more generally, on the importance of a meaningful freedom to fashion one's own life. But the dominant approaches in development economics, approaches still used all over the world, were not allies of Vasanti's struggle. They did not have an adequate conception of the lives people are striving to live. They equated doing well with an increase in gross domestic product per capita. In other words, Gujarat is pursuing the right policies just in case its economy is growing. This is the conception the human development approach, or otherwise known as the capabilities approach, aims to supplant. What's wrong with it? Well, first of all, even if we want an average measure that's a single number, an approach that I'll certainly call into question in a few minutes, it's far from obvious that average GDP is the right number. The recent influential Sarkozy Commission on the Measurement of Welfare, commissioned by President Sarkozy of France, but chaired by Sen and Stiglitz and several other economists, it was a commission on the measurement of welfare, argues that average household income would get us much closer to seeing how people are really doing. GDP does not adequately capture the daily perspective because the profits of foreign investment can be, and often are, repatriated by the foreign country in ways that don't necessarily change the lives of the people in the nation in which they invest. Furthermore, a crude measure like average GDP tells us nothing about distribution. It can thus give high marks to nations that contain alarming inequalities. For example, South Africa under apartheid used to shoot to the top of the development tables, despite the fact that a large majority of the people in that nation were totally unable to enjoy the fruits of the nation's overall prosperity. So too, in Vasanti's case, Gujarat is a rich state, but the benefits of foreign investment do not reach the poor, and they particularly do not reach women. Thus, the standard approach does not direct our attention to the reasons for Vasanti's inability to enjoy the fruits of her region's general prosperity. Indeed, by suggesting that Gujarat is a big success, they positively distract attention from her problems. Another shortcoming of approaches based on economic growth is that even when distribution is factored in, they fail to examine aspects of the quality of a human life that are not very well correlated with growth. Research shows clearly that promoting economic growth does not automatically improve people's health, their education, their opportunities for political participation, or the opportunities of women to protect their bodily integrity from rape and domestic violence. Evidence of this independence of key parts of a human life from GDP is given in the study by Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen that compared the achievements of the different Indian states. They found dramatic evidence that overall economic growth does not translate into achievements in healthcare and education, two issues that the Indian Constitution leaves to be handled by the states. States such as Gujarat and Andhra Pradesh, which have aggressively pursued policies of foreign investment, had high growth without good achievements in these other areas. Meanwhile, Kerala, a state whose economy has not grown well, in part on account of high labor costs that have driven the labor market to other states, nonetheless has such impressive achievements in health and education that it's the gold star of the development literature. 99% adolescent literacy in both boys and girls, against a background of 65% for men and 50% for women in the nation as a whole. In health, Kerala has a balanced sex ratio, contrasting with the excessive female mortality of many other states, and it has basic health achievements comparable to those of inner-city New York, which is shameful for New York, but excellent for a poor state in India. So, in short, if we want to ask about how Vasanti is doing in an insightful way, we need to determine what she is actually able to do and to be. And the answer to this question is simply not in the GDP number. How have her circumstances, familial, social, political, affected her ability to enjoy good health, to protect her bodily integrity, to attain an adequate education, to work on terms of mutual respect and equality with other workers, to participate in politics, to achieve self-respect and a sense of her own worth as a person and a citizen? Developing policies that are truly pertinent to her situation means asking all of these questions and others like them. Questions about meaningful human lives. It means crafting policies that do not simply raise the total or average GDP, but that promote a wide range of human capabilities, that is, opportunities that people have when and only when policy choices put them in a position to function effectively in a wide range of areas that are fundamental to a fully human life. Vasanti got some of these capabilities through the work of a private agency, but the government of her state did almost nothing to help her. One step up in adequacy, we have utility-based approaches, which measure the quality of life in a nation or a state by looking at the satisfaction of preferences and viewing the aim as that of maximizing satisfaction. This approach is really better because it has the advantage of actually focusing on people and asking each of them how they feel about their lives. But four major defects prevent it from being fully adequate. First, like the GDP approach, it neglects distribution. All satisfactions are simply funneled together so that the exceeding satisfaction of a lot of rich and middle-class people can justify misery at the bottom. The poor, in effect, are being used as means to the happiness of the rich. Second, like the GDP approach, again, it neglects the diverse elements of a human life, funneling all satisfactions together. All are assumed to be commensurable on a single quantitative scale. This problem was already noticed by John Stuart Mill, reviewing the work of utilitarianism's founder, Jeremy Bentham. Bentham thought of the item to be maximized as pleasure, not satisfaction, but in other respects his views are just the same as those of more recent utilitarians. Although Mill did consider himself a defender of a type of utilitarianism, he insisted that it had to make room for qualitative differences. For example, the pleasure of eating and drinking is just qualitatively different from the pleasure of educating oneself and reading a book. to reduce them to different quantities of the same thing is to leave out the specific qualities that make people choose them. Mill's subtle arguments have been widely accepted by philosophers, but are less often heeded by economists. One reason why a partnership between economics and philosophy is crucial in making progress on these difficult issues. Third, utilitarianism neglects the issue of what Sen and other economists have called adaptive preferences. That is, people tailor their satisfactions to the level they think they can actually achieve, so they often teach themselves to be content with an unjust state of affairs because the dissonance of unrealizable longing is too painful. But that means that the utilitarian approach is often the ally of an unjust status quo. If women don't report being dissatisfied with their educational level, for example, it might be because they're told more education is bad for women, well, there's no motivation in the approach to expand women's educational opportunities. Sen finds that adaptive preferences exist even with respect to bodily health. Finally, being based on satisfaction, the approach omits the value of striving and agency, which is a particularly important part of the struggles of the poor and of women. People don't want to just sit there and be taken care of. They want a future in which they are able to be active and to participate in making their own lives. This is part of what makes capability theorists think that the right approach is one that creates an enabling environment for people to choose meaningful lives. One more step further up, we have resource-based approaches that think of the quality of life in terms of the distribution of some basic all-purpose resources, such as wealth and income. This is a lot better because this distribution has been factored in. But there are still grave problems. Although wealth and income are surely good things to have, they're not good proxies for all the diverse aspects of development. Certainly, for example, not for political liberty, religious liberty, and participation. Moreover, people have varying needs for resources if they're to come up to the same level of capability to function. They also have different abilities to convert resources into functioning. Some of these differences are straightforwardly physical. A child needs more protein than an adult to achieve a similar level of healthy functioning. But the difference is that most interest capability theorists are social and connected with entrenched discrimination of various types. Thus, in a nation in which women are traditionally discouraged from pursuing an education, it will usually take more resources to promote female literacy than male literacy. Or, to cite Amartya Sen's famous example, a person who is in a wheelchair will require more resources connected with mobility than a person with so-called normal mobility, if the two are to attain a similar level of ability to move from place to place in that society. Taking stock of the defects of these other approaches, the capabilities approach begins with a very simple and yet at the same time highly complicated question. What are people really able to do and to be? The answer to that question is the set of capabilities or real opportunities that this person has. Capabilities can be used in a primarily comparative manner to give a richer account of the space of comparison between regions or nations. But we can also go further, and this has been my project, to use the idea of capabilities to develop a partial account of basic social justice, which could become the basis for constitution making. The idea of my version of the capabilities approach is that we begin with a conception of the dignity of the human being and of a life that's worthy of that dignity. As I've argued often, dignity is not an intuitive notion that does philosophical work all on its own. Rather, it has a vague content, that of being treated as an end and not a means, that must be given further clarity by its holistic relationship with a large family of political principles and concepts. So in my approach, as in that of John Rawls, justification is holistic, not foundational, and intuitions are only provisional. Nothing is unrevisable. With this provisional and yet central idea of dignity as a starting point, I then attempt to justify a list of 10 capabilities as central requirements of a life that is worthy of human dignity. These 10 capabilities are supposed to be general goals that can then be further specified by the society in question as it works on the account of foundational entitlements it wishes to endorse, whether in a written constitution or in some other way. But in some form, all are part of a minimum account of social justice. A society that does not guarantee all of these to all its citizens at some appropriate threshold level falls short of being a fully just society, whatever its level of opulence. Moreover, the capabilities are held to be important for each and every person. Each person is treated as an end, and none as a mere adjunct or means to the ends of others. And although in practical terms, priorities may have to be set temporarily, the capabilities are understood as both mutually supportive and as all of central relevance to social justice. Thus, a society that neglects one of them to promote the others has fallen short of social justice. Now, as you can already see, in my conception, central capabilities are closely related to human rights. Like rights, they include the idea of entitlement, but rights can be understood in a very thin and negative way. For example, the idea that rights are preserved just so long as government does nothing and keeps its hands off. That's a common understanding of rights in the U.S. Political tradition. Capabilities, by contrast, are positive. They require affirmative government support for their creation and preservation. I won't give you a full rundown of the by now familiar list, but very quickly, it includes 10 items: life, bodily health, bodily integrity, the development of senses, imagination, and thought, emotional health, practical reason, affiliation, relationships with other species and the world of nature, play and leisure time, and finally, control over one's material and political environment. Each of these is specified somewhat more concretely in the list itself, which connects the abstract ideas to familiar constitutional and political ideals. For example, senses, imagination, and thought includes an account of education rights and also of entitlements to freedom of expression and freedom of conscience. This list is emphatically a list of separate components. We cannot satisfy the need for one of them by just giving people a larger amount of another one. All are of central importance and all are distinct in quality. I accept Mill's claim about qualitative differences and build on it. The irreducible plurality of the list limits the trade-offs that will be reasonable to make and thus limits the applicability of quantitative cost-benefit analysis. At the same time, the items on the list are related to one another in many complex ways. One of the most effective ways of promoting women's control over their environment and their effective right of political participation is to promote women's education. Women who can seek employment outside the home have more resources in protecting their bodily integrity from assaults inside the home. Again, important research by Veena Agarwal shows that women who have land rights can stand up to domestic violence much more adequately than women who have no property rights. Such connections give us still more reason not to promote one capability at the expense of others. Among the capabilities, two, practical reason and affiliation, stand out as of special importance since they both organize and suffuse all the others, making their pursuit truly worthy of human dignity. To use one's senses in a way not infused by the characteristically human use of thought and planning is to use them in a manner not worthy of the equal dignity we all possess. The heroine in a wonderful short story by Rabindranath Tagore called Letter from a Wife, she describes herself as a free human mind, and this idea of herself infused all her other functions. Political principles and public policies play a large part in determining whether people do have the opportunity to function in accordance with practical reason and choice, as we can certainly see by comparing the situation of women in different parts of the world. Tagore's heroine basically had to leave Bengali society in order to get any chance to choose at all. Basanti was similarly limited until the loan from Seda gave her opportunities and choices. Similarly, political principles also shape the kinds of affiliations and associations that people are able to form, and the extent to which they have a range of affiliations open to them that are worthy of their human dignity. When women were only allowed to occupy positions of dependency and inferiority, for example, their societies were not giving them affiliation opportunities worthy of their equal human dignity. The basic intuition from which my version of the capability approach begins in the political arena is that human abilities exert a moral claim that they should be developed. Human beings are creatures such that, provided with the right educational and material support, they can become fully capable of all these human functions. That is, they're creatures with certain lower level abilities, which I call basic capabilities, to learn to perform the functions in question. When these capabilities are deprived of the nourishment that would transform them into the higher level abilities, the readiness to choose that figures on my list, they're fruitless, cut off, in some way, but a shadow of themselves. If a turtle were given a life that afforded a merely animal level of functioning, we would not have indignation or a sense of waste and tragedy. When a human being is given a life that lights powers of human action and expression, that does give us a sense of waste and tragedy. The tragedy that Tagore's heroine expresses in her statement to her husband in the story, where she says, "I am not one to die easily." In her view, a life without choice, a life in which she was a mere appendage, was a type of death of her humanity. The capabilities approach has recently been enriched by philosophers Jonathan Wolff and Avner Deschely in their important book, Disadvantage. In addition to providing support for the list of the 10 central capabilities, and in addition to developing strong arguments in favor of recognizing irreducibly heterogeneous goods, Wolff and Deschely introduced some new concepts that enrich the theoretical apparatus of the capabilities approach. The first new concept is that of capability security. They argue plausibly that what is crucial is that public policy should not simply give people a capability now, but give it to them in such a way that they can count on it for the future. Think about Basanti. When she had a loan from her brothers, she had a range of health and employment-related capabilities, but they were not secure, since her brothers could ask for the money back at any time, or even turn her out of the house. The Seva loan, by contrast, did give her security, because so long as she worked regularly, she could make the payments and even build up some savings. Working with new immigrant groups in their respective countries, Wolff and Deschely find that security about the future is of overwhelming importance in these people's ability to use and enjoy all the capabilities on the list. Notice that a feeling of security would be one aspect of the capability of emotional health, but they're talking about both feelings and reasonable expectations. Capability security is an objective matter and has not been satisfied if government bewitches people into believing that they're secure when they're really not. The security perspective means that for each capability, one must ask how far this has been protected from the whims of the market or of power politics. One way nations often promote capability security is through a written constitution that cannot be amended except by a laborious supramajoritarian process. But a constitution does not enforce itself, and a constitution contributes to security only in the presence of adequate access to the courts and justified confidence in the behavior of judges. Wolff and Deschely now introduce two further concepts of great interest: fertile functioning and corrosive disadvantage. A fertile functioning is one that tends to promote other related capabilities. Now, at this point, they really don't distinguish as clearly as they should between function and capability. I think the nice sound of the phrase fertile functioning has misled them, and we really should be talking about fertile capability. Well, they argue plausibly that affiliation is a fertile capability because it supports capability formation in many areas. Fertile capabilities are of many types, and which capabilities are fertile may vary from context to context. In Vasanti's story, we can see how access to credit was a fertile capability. The loan enabled her to protect her bodily integrity. She didn't have to go back to her abusive husband, to have employment options, to participate in politics, to have a sense of emotional well-being, to form valuable affiliations, and to enjoy enhanced self-respect. In other contexts, education plays a fertile role, opening up options of many kinds across the board. Corrosive disadvantage is the flip side of fertile capability. It's a deprivation that has particularly large effects elsewhere. In Vasanti's story, and indeed in so many women's lives all over the world, subjection to domestic violence is a corrosive disadvantage. The absence of protection for bodily integrity jeopardizes health, emotional well-being, affiliations, practical reason, employment, and no doubt others as well. The point of looking for fertile capabilities and corrosive disadvantages is to pinpoint the best intervention points for public policy. Each capability has importance on its own, and all citizens should be raised above the threshold on all 10 capabilities, but there are some capabilities that may justly take priority, and one reason to assign priority would be the fertility of the item in question or its tendency to remove a corrosive disadvantage. This idea helps us think about the tragic choices that sometimes come up between capabilities, for often the best way of preparing a tragedy-free future will be to select an especially fertile capability and devote our scarce resources to that. So let's now return to Vasanti and see how the lens of the capabilities approach illuminates her situation. The script of Vasanti's life was largely written by men on whom she was dependent: her father, her husband, the brothers who helped her out when her marriage collapsed. This dependency put her at risk with respect to life and health, denied her the education that would have developed her powers of thought. Remember, she couldn't read or write, and she was 32 years old when I met her, and prevented her from thinking of herself as a person who has a plan of life to shape and choices to make. In the marriage itself, she did worst of all, losing her bodily integrity to domestic violence, her emotional equanimity to fear, and being cut off from meaningful forms of affiliation, familial, friendly, and civic. For these reasons, she did not really have a conception of herself as a free and dignified being whose worth is equal to that of others. Mundane matters of property, employment, and credit play a large role here. The fact that she held no property in her own name, had no literacy, and no employment-related skills, and no access to credit except from her male relatives, all this cemented her dependent status and kept her in an abusive relationship far longer than she otherwise would have chosen. So we see here how closely all the capabilities are related to one another, how the absence of one, bad in itself, also erodes others. Vasanti also had some good luck. She had no abusive in-laws to put up with, and she had brothers who were more than usually solicitous of her well-being. So she could and did leave the bad marriage without going into sex work or turning to some other dangerous or degrading occupation. But this good luck created new forms of dependency. The Save loan changed the picture. Vasanti now had not only an income, but also independent control over her livelihood. Even when she still owed a lot of money, it was much better to owe it to Seva than to her brothers. Being part of a mutually supportive network of women was crucially different in respect of both practical reason and affiliation from being a poor relative given a handout. Her sense of her dignity increased as she paid off the loan and began saving. By the time I met her, she had achieved considerable self-confidence and a sense of worth, and her affiliations with other women in both groups and personal friendships were a new source of both pleasure and pride to her. Her participation in political life had also gone way up as she joined in the project of another woman, Kokila, who was, I should say, a lower caste woman whom she never would have met in ordinary social life because she was a poor Brahmin that she met in the women's movement. So she joined with Kokila's project to prod the police to investigate more cases of domestic violence. Interestingly, she said to me that she now felt that she had the capacity to be a good woman or a good person by giving something to other people, something that the narrow focus on survival had not permitted her to do. Reflecting on her situation, we notice how little the public sector did for her and how lucky she was that one of the best women's non-governmental organizations in the world was right in her own backyard. Gujarat, whose chief minister is now the candidate for the prime minister of the nation, so we should really pay attention to this case. Gujarat has pursued a growth-focused agenda. The results of that growth do not reliably trickle down to help the worse off. Government failed to ensure her an education. It failed to prosecute her husband for abuse or to offer her any shelter from that abuse. It failed to secure her equal property rights in her own family. It failed to offer her access to credit. Indeed, the only strong role government played in Vasanti's life was negative, the cash incentive payment for her husband's vasectomy, which made her vulnerable position still more so. We can see that the important features of Vasanti's situation are much more fully opened up for diagnosis and treatment by the capabilities approach than by its rivals. This diagnostic and remedial value derives directly from the interdisciplinarity of the approach. Economics has been infused by a humanistic understanding of life deriving from philosophy, from gender studies, and from the study of history. But now, turn to the second part, reasonable pluralism and political liberalism. The capabilities list is a single list, and it's recommended for all people in large heterogeneous societies such as India or the United States. Moreover, it's recommended for all the different nations of the world. And I actually think this is the same issue writ large, because all modern nations by now contain all the same plural religions and other doctrines of life's meaning and value that a diverse nation does, only the history and the numbers are different. So I'll focus first on the domestic case and then briefly turn to the world case. So why would it be appropriate to recommend a single list for all the diverse people in a large nation? And what restrictions do considerations of cultural and religious pluralism lead us to introduce in order to make it a defensible philosophical conception? Put another way, what's wrong with Aristotle's idea that we should base our political principles on a single, fully comprehensive account of the flourishing life? Well, what's the problem? In a nutshell, it's this. In any modern society, citizens have many different visions of the meaning and purposes of life. Some are religious, and some are secular. Political principles should recognize and respect that diversity. One way of respecting diversity is to protect ample areas of liberty. People should be free to live in accordance with their own ideas of the good, except when the equal rights of others or some other very urgent public considerations, such as those of peace and safety, are at stake. We could think of this principle as a large version of the United States Constitution's free exercise clause. That clause is couched in terms of religion, but we can imagine an extension of it to non-religious ideas of life as well. But liberty is just one problem that diversity brings with it. Another is equality. For sometimes, governments tolerate a religion or a way of life, but disfavor it, whether by creating unequal conditions of liberty for different groups or by making public statements that create favored and disfavored groups, in-groups and out-groups. This is where we get to the idea that Charles Larmor and John Rawls famously called the idea of political liberalism. And it can usefully be seen as a larger version of the US Constitution's Establishment Clause. We should have no established comprehensive governmental account of the preferred way to live. So we should refuse to base political principles on such an account because it's bound to be biased in favor of some views of how one should live and against others. Such an establishment of religion or of a secular comprehensive doctrine fails to show equal respect to everyone. Larmor and Rawls argue, and I agree, that political principles may still and should still have a moral content. This content is not neutral, and it does rule out many conceptions of how one should live that real people might hold, all those that fail to express equal respect for citizens, for example, such as doctrines that assign core political functions along lines of racial or gender hierarchy. People would remain free to hold and express such views, but the Constitution of the nation will have committed itself to a contradictory view, so they can't simply bring up their view for legislative enactment by majority vote. Albeit moral, however, political principles must be partial rather than fully comprehensive in order to give citizens plenty of space to pursue their own views and in order to treat everyone with equal respect. They must be partial in two ways. They must first be narrow in extent, that is, not covering all the matters that comprehensive views cover, leaving lots of matters for citizens' comprehensive doctrines to resolve, for example, the ultimate destiny of the soul after death. And they must also be thin, not taking a stand on divisive metaphysical or epistemological questions, such as the existence of an immortal soul or whether there are self-evident truths, because to take a stand on such matters, when they can be avoided, will be to bias the political conception in the direction of one religion or comprehensive doctrine rather than another. Rawls calls this the method of avoidance, and it's prompted by considerations of equal respect. Something similar was the idea of the framers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as Jacques Maritain very nicely spells out in his writings about the Universal Declaration. He was one of the framers. Coming together from different nations and religions, the framers refused to use divisive religious or metaphysical notions, for example, the notion of the soul, but they felt that they could come together around an inclusive ethical notion, such as that of human dignity. So, any concepts we use to frame political principles must be both thin and narrow. At this point, it would be very tempting to return to one of those that we previously rejected, such as income and wealth or utility, on the grounds of their utterly inclusive neutrality. But we've already seen their defects, and we've argued that both development and the theory of justice need to think about meaningful human lives. So, how would a view that incorporates the human striving for a meaningful life be able to be abstemious and narrow in a suitable way? The answer is already present in the second half of Ulhak's statement, which summarized the thinking of many of us in the Human Development and Capabilities Organization, namely the focus on enabling, or as we say, on capabilities, creating enabling conditions for the choice of a variety of functions is abstemious because it allows citizens to choose which ones they will actualize. Someone who has access to adequate nutrition can always choose to fast for religious reasons or some other reason, but there's a great deal of difference between fasting and starving, and it's that difference that we want to capture. Someone who doesn't want leisure time and prefers to work all the time can always choose that life, and many people do, but there's a large difference between that chosen life and the so-called double day, that is, working a full-day job and then doing all the childcare and all the domestic labor, that stops millions of women the world over from choosing leisure activities that would help to make their lives meaningful. One may also refuse to vote or participate in politics, as the religion called the Old Order Amish does in the United States. But it would be quite a different thing, and an assault on their fundamental political equality, to deny them the right to vote or the capability of voting. But the capabilities list is not just thin, it's also narrow. It doesn't pronounce on many matters. It leaves many spaces for citizens to graft the political conception onto a more comprehensive doctrine of a meaningful life. The capabilities list, together with the specification of a threshold level of adequacy, articulates, as Wilhak said, a set of enabling conditions. And it argues that these conditions are helpful for and potentially agreed on by all the holders of reasonable comprehensive conceptions of value. They can, to use Rawls's term, form the object of an overlapping consensus among the different doctrines. And I should emphasize that this defense of political liberalism is mine and not that of Amartya Sen, who I believe does not agree with this and may well favor a more comprehensive doctrine of liberalism and choice, but that's a different topic. The capabilities approach is not a single philosophical theory, it's a general type of approach, and it houses many debates on important matters, including political liberalism. When we reach the international scene, there are 5 additional points to be made about the normative proposal. Here I'm not thinking about a world state, which I actually do not favor. I'm thinking about shared aspirations that link states and that could be embodied in treaty commitments and ultimately in the domestic constitutions of nations. As I've said, the issues here are really very much the same as in the case of domestic social justice in pluralist societies, but now there's an additional worry to be faced. We must meet the challenge that by focusing on a single list, we are behaving in a colonialist fashion, imposing some Western norms on non-Western subjects who have many reasons for suspicion. The first point to be made, then, is that I consider the list as open-ended and subject to ongoing revision and rethinking, in a way that any society's account of its most fundamental entitlements is always subject to supplementation or deletion. And we might add, second, that the approach really isn't Western in origin at all, as my mention of Sen, an Indian citizen, and of Ulhaq, a Pakistani citizen, already suggests. Sen was the founder of the approach, and he was later joined by a multinational team. Sen's thought was inspired by many sources, but especially important was the thought of Indian thinker Rabindranath Tagore, who created an experimental school in which Sen's grandfather was a leading professor and his mother was a leading dancer. Sen's father, a civil engineer, oversaw the school's rural development projects. So he grew up in an atmosphere of indigenous Bengali reform focused on ideas of human empowerment. These ideas are of intrinsic interest, and in fact I write about them a lot in my new book. But as far as colonialism goes, that charge betrays an ignorance of the complexity of non-Western traditions that is itself somewhat irritatingly condescending. If there's an attractive account of human choice and freedom, it must be Western in origin. Well, that assumption is certainly incorrect. At present, the Human Development and Capability Association, the international association we founded to pursue the approach, contains over 800 members from 80 different countries. I also insist, the third point, that the items on the list ought to be specified in a somewhat abstract and general way, precisely in order to leave room for the activities of specifying and deliberating by citizens and their legislatures and courts. It's really a blueprint for nation-state, nation-based action, and nations should always act with an eye to their own particular histories. Within certain parameters, it's perfectly appropriate that different nations should do this somewhat differently, taking their histories and special circumstances into account. Thus, for example, a free speech right that suits Germany well, where it's permitted to ban all anti-Semitic speech and political organizing, is probably too restrictive in the different climate of the United States, which has protected the right of neo-Nazis to speak and organize demonstrations. Fourth, the major liberties that protect pluralism are central items on the list: the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, the freedom of conscience. By placing them on the list, we give them a central and non-negotiable place. Once again, contrary to the claims of some European writers, for example, even a writer I much admire, Timothy Garden Ash, writing about free speech in the New York Review of Books, these norms themselves are not particularly Western, and they have a long history in India and other parts of the developing world. There's a lot to be said about that, but I won't say more here. Fifth and finally, I insist on a rather strong separation between issues of justification and issues of implementation. I believe we can philosophically justify this list as a good basis for political principles all around the world. But this does not mean that we thereby license intervention with the affairs of a state that does not recognize them. It's a basis for persuasion, but I hold that military and even economic sanctions are justified only in certain very grave circumstances involving traditionally recognized crimes against humanity. So it seems less objectionable to recommend something to everyone once we point out that it's part of the view that national sovereignty, grounded in the consent of the people, is a very important part of the whole package. Now, before concluding, it's time to talk about philosophy. We live in a world in which economics has enormous prestige, and philosophy, along with the humanities more generally, has relatively low prestige. Government commissions dealing with development issues typically ask the advice of economists, not philosophers. Even in our Human Development and Capability Association, this preference for economists has created difficulty in the selection of plenary speakers and of presidents of the association. At a 3-day international conference celebrating Amartya Sen's 75th birthday held in New Delhi, philosophy was given no role at all on the program, all of which was filled by economists and policy experts. I was on the program at the concluding section, and I did inject philosophy, but I was invited because of my collaboration with Sen, not because of my being a philosopher, and nobody even suggested that I ought to speak about philosophy. The awe with which economists are typically greeted in the policy world contrasts with the neglect and sometimes even disdain shown to philosophy. This was not always the case. The discipline of economics grew out of philosophy, not to mention long ago contributors such as Aristotle. Adam Smith linked his path-breaking economic analysis to normative philosophical arguments, which economists typically ignore, thus grossly misinterpreting Adam Smith. So let's mention a few aspects of the view I sketched above that require a philosophical analysis and on which they need to be continually challenged by subtle and contending philosophical arguments. First, justice. Philosophers of the past 100 years or so have made dramatic progress in understanding the concept of social justice and describing its necessary conditions. This work needs to be added to the focus on capabilities if the approach is to have the power to do more than merely provide a space of comparison. Through my own extended dialogue with John Rawls, I've tried to move the capabilities approach into that space. But now we need to go further, developing adequate theories of global justice and of the obligations of richer to poorer nations. This work is ongoing in philosophy, and development needs to incorporate it. Second, welfare and non-commensurability. My approach, of course, operates with a list of goods held to be plural and non-commensurable, linking that to the idea of human well-being. And yet, outside of this heterodox small group of economists, and maybe by now some of my law and economics colleagues, most accounts of social welfare still lean too heavily on the Benthamite tradition of utilitarianism, failing to take cognizance even of John Stuart Mill's subtle critique, emphasizing qualitative distinctions. This philosophical insight is already in Aristotle, and it's quite comical, really, that economists don't feel the need to grapple with it. Equally problematic is the tendency of many economists to follow both in equating welfare with happiness and happiness with a single sensation, varying only in quantity and not in quality. Aristotle already showed that human happiness or flourishing is itself plural, and yet very few economists are even aware of his arguments. I would add that one of the great merits of the Wolff-Deschalite book is its rigorous and very compelling treatment of this issue of non-commensurability, and it's no accident that they're both philosophers. Most of the psychological research on happiness that economists use today is naive and superficial on just this issue. Third, political liberalism. The focus of my whole talk, or particularly the second half, has been on developing a philosophical contribution that starts from the work of philosophers Charles Larmor and John Rawls, and on showing why these insights are crucial to thinking well about development. One finds, however, that economists typically just ignore this whole topic, basing their accounts of welfare on one particular comprehensive doctrine, and not having any worry about failures of equal respect involved. So I found that I really had to write about the urgent importance of this idea and the reasons why development theory and policy should embrace it. And so I did in the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs in 2011, in the process trying to clear up some obscurity in the way that Rawls himself articulates that theory. And yet, you guessed it, this philosophical contribution, published in a philosophy journal, has been totally ignored by development practitioners, even those who espouse the human development approach, as I found in sessions organized around my recent book on capabilities. So, I'm now republishing it in a volume called Capabilities and Gender Equality that's coming out from Cambridge University Press, so maybe then they might read it, I don't know. But fourth, and a related issue, philosophy offers us rich and persuasive arguments concerning relativism and universalism, an issue of central importance to development policy, and yet one with respect to which economists tend to be very naive. Much of the work I did with Sen at the World Institute for Development Economics Research focused on this question, calling on major philosophers such as Hilary Putnam, Sheila Ben-Habib, Charles Taylor, and Tim Scanlon to present arguments on these matters very clearly for an economics and policy audience. Has it done any good? Well, the arguments go forward in a very subtle way within philosophy and in those contributions to the development literature that are made by philosophers. But there's a lot to be desired, and I find that I need to repeat myself more often than I would like concerning how I would answer the charge of cultural imperialism. And finally, the nature of emotion and desire. This is, of course, a large group of issues, only briefly mentioned in this talk, concerning which philosophy has long been developing subtle accounts, while economics tends to use a narrower and cruder set of concepts. One aspect of philosophy's contribution can be seen in the important concept of adaptive preferences, which I discussed earlier. Understanding that preferences are adaptive in this way gives us powerful normative arguments against a simple preference-based approach to welfare. But there are many other issues, and economics needs to come to terms with them. I see little sign that this is happening. I should add that in this area, as in many of my others, law of economics proves much more responsive to philosophy than most of the rest of economics. Perhaps the reason for this is the interdisciplinary character of modern law schools. I regularly co-teach with an economist colleague, for example. Another reason is that law is always dealing with reality, and its theories rarely rise to the heights of mathematical abstraction from which the struggles of real people like Vasanti cannot be seen. And yet, I should add, even this is in jeopardy, because now there's an outcry to make law school only 2 years instead of 3 years post-BA. And if that happens, there's no room for the contribution to law of people like me and of historians and other disciplines. Other philosophers would emphasize other issues, so this list is just meant as an introduction related to what I've argued in this paper, not an exhaustive enumeration. Economics used to make room for such questions, in the time of Adam Smith. Today, however, it largely ignores all of them, and the accounts of development that are produced without the participation of philosophy leave a lot to be desired. But let me now just return in concluding to the human development approach and its contrast with rival theories. So let's think again of that small, determined woman who showed up in the offices of Cero one day in 1998. The struggle for opportunity, for capability, is one that is being waged by millions of poor people all over the world. Some, disgracefully, are in rich and developed countries. My own nation should hang its head in shame at the notorious fact that the health status of inner-city New Yorkers in Harlem is less robust than the average in Kerala, but a state that's poor, but one with a demonstrated concern for equality in healthcare and education. Nor is Vasanti's struggle to escape domestic violence foreign to the rich nations. In my own nation, the National Violence Against Women survey published by the Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that 18% of U.S. women have experienced rape or attempted rape, usually from an intimate partner, and the rate of physical violence is approximately double that. So, all nations have a lot of work to do if they want to secure the central capabilities of all their people. How can nations help one another in fighting this good struggle? One way, surely, is financial aid. And I believe that the richer nations of the world owe a lot to the poorer nations in connection with economic and educational development. But another aid in this struggle is good intellectual work. Theories influence the way things happen. The old development theories were used by the IMF and the World Bank. They affected the way aid was doled out, the way data were gathered. In many ways, they deflected attention from the struggles of the poorest. But now, the chief economist at the World Bank is a former president of the Human Development and Capability Association. So that's kind of a great change. The capabilities approach is not exactly telling Vasanti anything that by now, after years of education in Seda, she doesn't already know. But it's able to combat the defective theoretical approaches in the corridors of power. In that way, serving as an ally of the poor and the excluded, a kind of lawyer arguing their case. People matter, and ideas matter only because people matter. But ideas do matter for people, and we all need to put our heads together across the boundaries of discipline and geography that divide us if the world's pressing problems of exclusion and inequality are to be solved. The ideas of even the most thoughtful and heterodox development economists, however, will not solve these problems without the contribution of philosophy.